Chapter 14. The True Face of Evil. In the concrete minds of people who perceive them as being boogeymen and spectres, Obama isn't merely a centrist Democrat, he's a Kenyan Muslim communist and a Nazi, somehow, who created ISIS death panels and sought to exterminate Christians in FEMA concentration camps, and even now is secretly running the deep state from an underground bunker near the White House, working every moment of every day to discredit and ultimately destroy our heroic Lord and Saviour Donald Trump. Hillary wasn't merely a former First Lady turned Senator and Secretary of State who mishandled her emails and voted for the invasion of Iraq. Instead, she was also a part of Obama's evil Muslim, communist, Nazi, atheist conspiracy to destroy America, helped create ISIS, and ran a child sex ring out of the basement of a DC pizza parlor, which has no basement. Jeremy Corbyn isn't merely at time of writing the twice democratically elected leader of the Labour Party and thus of Her Majesty's opposition. Instead, he is an IRA, Hamas and Hezbollah supporting white working class hating reverse racist and Marxist anti-Semite, or at the very least an enabler of anti-Semitism, who despises the monarchy, yearns to abolish the military, and if elected, will destroy Britain by imposing communism and allowing in a tidal wave of Muslim immigration. And bearing this in mind, Momentum isn't merely a grassroots political movement which seeks to engage and motivate what we describe as the left, supporting Jeremy Corbyn because they support his vision of a fairer, more equal society and refuse to allow centrists to drag the Labour Party back down into the days of being nothing but Tory light. Instead, they are militant Trotskyites who've infiltrated the party in order to impose their evil, violent, hard-left agenda through abuse and intimidation, and similarly, the hundreds of thousands of new Labour Party members who've joined since Corbyn became leader in 2015 are all entryists, encouraged to aid the takeover of the party by radical far-left organisations who can't even persuade more than a few thousand people to join their own organisations. Likewise, Black Lives Matter isn't merely a grassroots movement calling out and demanding an end to institutionalised racism and police brutality. Instead, it's a black supremacist hate group which is devoted to killing cops. Planned Parenthood isn't merely a non-profit sexual health provider with abortions making up only 3% of the work it performs every year. Instead, it was founded as a means of controlling or even exterminating the black population, is committing a holocaust against unborn babies, and is making literal blood money by selling their body parts. And similarly, Anita Sarkeesian isn't merely a feminist who analyses pop culture and entertainment through a feminist lens on YouTube and ran a Kickstarter that turned out to be radically more successful than she could possibly have dreamed. Instead, she's a thief and a con artist who somehow stole or swindled the money which people donated to her Kickstarter of their own free will, and worse, she's part of, if not the evil Jewish/Armenian leader, or puppet, depending upon who you ask, of the evil feminazi SJW conspiracy to oppress and eventually exterminate all men, starting by having all supposedly sexist games banned or censored and replaced with lesbian walking simulators. A conspiracy which includes having SJW feminazis infiltrate games journalism and have sex with games journalists to ensure that evil SJW games receive high scores and good reviews in order to trick games companies into believing that there is a market for such propaganda, when on the contrary everyone knows that #RealGamersTM, which is to say straight white cis males and the token supporters who they tolerate as long as they tell them what they want to hear and constantly reassure them that they are the good guys, only want to play the games that whining leftist SJW snowflakes condemn. Have you spotted the pattern yet? The fact that because their entire position, ideology and worldview is literally nothing but a projection of their insecurity, anger and fear onto the other who they believe are infiltrating and destroying the natural order of things, each of these examples serve to demonstrate how those who we describe as being on the right and in the centre only ever really attack a straw man of what they perceive to be the left. That while what we describe as the left, which is essentially just anyone who seeks to change society, primarily criticise the actions and inactions of the right and the centre, accusing them of being evil for caging children or for caring more about their own money than they do about human lives, the people who feel threatened by change only ever really attack a grossly exaggerated or non-existent boogeyman. Indeed, while most of the examples that I just listed are believed and spread by the American right, the Momentum example demonstrates how the entire basis of the centrist conceit that the far left and the far right are both just as bad as each other is the perception of the left as invaders who threaten their emotional comfort, status, privilege, and entitlement. A perception which, as I explained in Chapter 12, means that when push comes to shove, self-proclaimed moderate centrists, classical liberals, and what have you will almost invariably side with the far right in order to maintain the status quo, rendering their just as bad line and calls for a pox on both your houses an absurd hypocrisy. And speaking of which, while it's impossible to ignore the self-righteous hypocrisy of people on the right and in the centre declaring that you just accuse anyone who disagrees with you of being a Nazi, then turning around and accusing Antifa, for example, of being the real fascists, we must never forget that in most people's minds, only evil individuals and organisations will ever falsely accuse anyone, so how dare you challenge my self-righteous conceit that I'm a good person by falsely accusing me of being the bad guy, you evil Stalin-worshipping baby-eater. Because remember, according to the self-righteous blame game that we laughably describe as morality, only other people who are perceived as being a threat to what we believe the world should be can ever be genuinely evil, so that makes them the bad guys and us the good guys by default. And beyond this as well, as a direct result of the instinctive human need to anthropomorphise or personify things which we perceive as being an antagonist or a threat, the individuals, organisations and movements that I listed at the beginning of this chapter are not merely perceived or portrayed as being a threat to the in-group or the village, but rather as the personification or manifestation of that threat, as the dragon who the noble heroes seek to slay, because once the dragon is dead, then obviously the village will be safe. And no different from the boogeymen who we thought were hiding under our beds when we were children, the fact that the straw left which they attack is nothing but a projection of their own fears and insecurities results in both a really big fish story with the tale of how evil the straw left are and the threat which they pose to society growing in direct proportion to the intensity of the teller's own frustrated rage, anxiety and fear, and also, far more importantly, a paradox in which actually defeating their opponents will force them to admit that they were nothing but straw men all along. Because in the end, these boogeymen of the left are not, never were, and never possibly could be the dragons which they are portrayed as being, and therefore slaying them doesn't change a single thing. You may ask, but isn't that also true of everyone who is currently attacking Trump? Aren't leftists, liberals, progressives, and the elite attacking, vilifying, and demonising him just as much as the right demonised Obama? Although there is a modicum of truth to this claim, there are two vital distinctions between the often literal demonisation of Obama and what some now describe as Trump derangement syndrome. First of all, the fact that to the best of my knowledge, most if not all of the criticism and condemnation of Trump is based upon demonstrable facts and evidence, while the criticism and condemnation of Obama was and still is overwhelmingly built upon conspiracy theories, which is to say, on the assertion that the lack of evidence or mountains of conflicting evidence are actually evidence for your claim because it supposedly proves that they are hiding the truth. But secondly, though, and far more importantly, as a direct result of the fact that progressives, liberals, leftists, or whatever label we use are working to reshape society, when Trump is gone, we will move on, just as we did after Bush Jr. left the White House. That, to give another topical example, although people apparently fear and condemn Antifa more than they fear and condemn the white supremacists and others who they are quote-unquote attacking, anti-fascism, as the name suggests, will cease to exist the moment that fascism does, which is to say that when people stop trying to convince the majority to impose and support policies based upon the conceit that the so-called white race is superior and so forth, anti-fascism will quite literally become obsolete, while on the other hand, bearing in mind the paradox that I just mentioned a moment ago, as a direct result of the fact that they are merely fighting a projection of their own resentment, insecurity and fear, actually defeating their opponents would force reactionary regressives to face up to reality, to admit that they were only ever attacking straw men to make themselves feel better, because defeating them hasn't solved their problems. And so therefore trapped in the self-contradictory doublethink of believing that the dragons whom they seek to slay are both all-powerful demons who secretly control the world and inferior parasites who can be easily crushed under their heels, because after all, isn't the very reason why these dragons seek to destroy society the fact that they are jealous of the in-group's inherent superiority? Reactionary regressives do everything in their power to keep the spectre of their enemies alive, as evidenced by their continuing obsession with Hillary and Obama. And going back to what I said in my first point regarding conspiracy theories, the very reason why they convince themselves that the lack of evidence is evidence is that accepting that Hillary and Obama are merely human beings means no longer having a dragon onto which they can project all of their impotent resentment and rage. At time of writing, in fact, on top of the endless chants of lock her up, the hashtag QAnon conspiracy theory, which is essentially just a melting pot of all of the Hillary and Obama deep state conspiracy theories that I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, is becoming the mainstream among Trump supporters, with many who attend his rallies wearing Q t-shirts and holding up signs declaring "We are Q." And even in 2020, when, assuming that he lasts that long, Trump will be running against a completely different Democratic candidate, it's a safe bet that he and his base will be running the 2016 campaign all over again, still attacking, condemning and demonizing Hillary and boasting about how he won the Electoral College, because ultimately, although he won that election, Hillary, and more importantly, everything that she represents in the minds of Trump and his supporters, still exists, and they still perceive it as being a threat, because it still makes them feel uncomfortable, since no matter how much they struggle to hold back the tide, society is still changing all around them. And so even if in 2020 Trump and his supporters project all of their nebulous rage, frustration and fear of the other onto the new Democratic candidate, whoever that may be, they'll simply be putting a different mask on the same dragon, or more accurately, pinning a different photo to the same emotional punching bag. But you may ask, interjecting for the second time, isn't that precisely what some leftists, liberals, progressives and others do as well? Yes, because as I've now stated repeatedly, absolutely everyone who is capable of forming such opinions is vulnerable to succumbing to concrete thinking, including those who are on what we describe as the left. But bearing in mind that self-righteously declaring both sides to be just as bad as each other is also a sign of concrete-mindedness, it is once again vital to remember that while one side wants genuine change and progress, the other merely seeks emotional comfort, and therefore, while those who genuinely seek to change society usually have tangible and concrete goals, even though there is almost never any universal agreement on what they should be or how we should achieve them, those who fear and resist change and progress never have any goal beyond making everything that they fear, hate and blame go away, meaning that although what we describe as the far right offers the appearance of genuine radical social change and progress, their policies and rhetoric always inevitably boil down to nothing but protect the village, and thus allow everything to be the way that it should naturally be by keeping the outsiders out.